There is something about the world of Avatar that feels heavier than a cartoon should, like it has weight to it, gravity. And at the center of that gravity sit these figures, these benders, these spirits, these old generals and young prodigies who carry entire nations inside their chests. Tonight, we are going to move through them slowly, one by one. We are going to sit with the most powerful characters in all of Avatar, the Last Airbender, and just look at them. Not in a hurried way, not like a ranking list or a battle analysis, more like the way you would study a painting in a quiet museum at the end of the day when the crowds have gone and the only sound left is the faint hum of the building and your own breathing. We are going to talk about where they came from and what they could do and what made them terrifying or beautiful or both at the same time. We are going to let the details settle over you like warm air, and by the time we have made our way through all of them, you will probably be somewhere far from wherever you are right now. So settle in, turn off the light if you have not already, let your shoulders drop. We start at the very beginning, which is also, in a way, the end. Before we go on, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely love reading them. Whether it is 2 in the afternoon on a quiet Tuesday or 3 in the morning during one of those sleepless nights when the ceiling has nothing new to offer, and you need something to carry you somewhere else. Leave your time and your place, and subscribe if you want to be here for more of these. It means a lot. Now, let us go back 10,000 years. Wan, the first Avatar, the man who carried the world on his shoulders. 10,000 years is a number that slides off the mind. It is too large to hold. But somewhere inside that span, in a time before the four nations existed, before there were scrolls or palaces or maps of any kind, there was a young man named Wan who stole a piece of fire from a lion turtle and changed the shape of everything that ever came after him. His name in Chinese means 10,000, as in the 10,000 years between his life and Korra's. It is also phonetically close to the English word one, which is exactly what he was. The first one, the original, the moment before the cycle began. The world Wan was born into looked almost nothing like the world we know from the show. Humanity did not live in great cities spread across continents. They lived on the backs of enormous lion turtles. These were not metaphors. These were vast creatures, so large they could support entire civilizations on their shells, so ancient they were present at the beginning of time itself. They granted humans the power to bend one of the four elements during hunting trips into the spirit wilds, the overgrown, dangerous landscape that covered most of the land where spirits roamed freely and most things would kill you if given the chance. You received your element from the lion turtle's touch. You went into the wilds, you came back, and then you gave the power back. That was the arrangement. Wan broke the arrangement. He was not a villain for doing it. He was something more complicated and more interesting than that. He was a young man from the lower caste of his city, living under the boot of a wealthy family called the Chu family, who controlled the lion turtle's gifts and used them to hoard power. Wan stole fire in an act of rebellion, kept it instead of returning it, used it to raid the Chu family stores and was caught, and was then banished into the spirit wilds as punishment. He asked the lion turtle, the enormous creature whose shell his entire world had been built upon, if he could at least keep the fire so he would not die out there. The lion turtle agreed. That small act of mercy changed everything. Because Wan did not die in the wilds, he learned to live there. He made friends with the spirits, which sounds like something that should be easy but was actually deeply unusual for a human at that time. Humans and spirits were not companions. They were often predators and prey, depending on the day. But Wan had something that made him different from most people. He kept an open mind. He was remorseful when he made mistakes. He had a curiosity about the world that was wider than his own survival. Over 2 years in the spirit wilds, Wan became the first human to truly form the art of firebending. Not just holding fire, which many humans could do, but moving with it, combining it with footwork and intention, transforming a natural force into a martial language. He could outmatch wanderers who had also been given fire, because they had been given a tool and he had built a discipline. Then came the moment that the entire Avatar universe pivots on. Wan was walking through the wilds when he encountered 2 ancient spirits, locked in combat. One was enormous and dark, writhing with chaos. The other was smaller and radiant, struggling to contain the first. Wan, seeing what he thought was an unfair fight, intervened. He separated them. He had freed Vatu, the dark spirit, the embodiment of chaos and darkness, who Rava, the spirit of light and peace, had been holding at bay for millennia. Juan had not known. He was told he was helping, he was deceived, and the consequence of that single act of misplaced kindness was the release of darkness into the world. The corruption of gentle spirits into something violent, the beginning of a chaos that would take enormous sacrifice to contain. To understand how profoundly Juan felt this, you have to understand what Rava was. She was not just old, she was ancient beyond any meaningful definition of the word. She had existed for over 10,000 lifetimes before the first humans appeared. She and Vatu had spent those lifetimes in an eternal cycle of conflict, neither able to fully destroy the other. When Rava defeated Vatu, what little darkness existed inside her would grow until he was reborn. When Vatu threatened to win, the reverse would happen. They were not enemies in a simple sense. They were the two necessary poles of existence itself. When Juan freed Vatu, he did not just make a mistake. He shook the foundations of the cosmos. He spent the next year trying to fix it. Rava, small and weakening because Vatu grew stronger with every spirit he corrupted, agreed to travel with Juan. She could hold one element inside herself at a time and pass it to Juan. This arrangement was painful for her. When she carried an element she was not holding for herself, it strained her. But she did it because the alternative was worse. Together they visited the other lion turtle cities, receiving the elements of air, water, and earth, each one temporarily held by Rava and passed to Juan so he could learn to use them. There is something in this image that stays with you if you let it. Two beings, one human and exhausted and guilty, one ancient and radiant and diminishing, traveling through a dangerous world together, learning to trust each other, developing a partnership out of shared consequence. Juan embodied the qualities of each element as he learned them. He had started with fire, the burning passion, and the need for justice. He added air and learned patience and detachment. He grew into water and learned to redirect and flow. He began to understand Earth's stubborn permanence. He was becoming something no human had ever been. The harmonic convergence arrived. This was the event that occurred every 10,000 years when the planets aligned, when the spirit portals at the poles merged, when the boundary between the spirit world and the physical world thinned to almost nothing, and when Rava and Vatu would battle again for the fate of the world. Vatu was stronger than he had ever been. The year of spreading chaos had fed him enormously. Rava had weakened. The fight was not going in their favor. Juan placed his hand on the spirit portal. He felt the amplified spiritual energy of the convergence itself. And he made the decision. He permanently bonded his spirit with Rava's. Not just temporarily, not just for a battle, forever. The light that exploded from that merging was the first avatar state. Juan, carrying Rava inside him and wielding all four elements simultaneously, fought Vatu and sealed him inside the Tree of Time. He closed the spirit portals to prevent future conflict between humans and spirits. He spent the rest of his life trying to bring peace to a world that had just learned what war looked like. He died eventually. He died on a battlefield, surrounded by the giant stone coins that were weapons of early earthbenders, fighting in a war his powers had not been enough to prevent. In his final moments, as Rava held his fading spirit, he told her that he had not had enough time, that he had not finished. She told him, "The cycle begins." He was the first avatar. He set in motion a cycle of reincarnation that would repeat for 10,000 years, carrying his memories and Rava's spirit through every lifetime that followed. Every avatar who came after him carried a piece of Juan. The weight of that first mistake, the commitment that followed it, the idea that a person could cause something terrible and still spend the rest of their life trying to make it right, that is where the avatar began. Not with destiny or prophecy, with a young man who stole a fire and accidentally broke the world and then gave everything he had to put it back together. Rava, she who existed before everything else. If Juan is the beginning of the avatar cycle, Rava is the reason the avatar exists at all. And she is, in many ways, the most quietly powerful being in the entire franchise, because her power is not the kind you measure in explosions or battle outcomes. It is the kind you measure in time. She had existed for over 10,000 lifetimes before humans appeared. Think about what that means for a moment. Before there were people, before there were lion turtles sheltering those people, before there was history or culture or war, Rava was already old. She and Vatu had already been in their eternal cycle for so long that the length of it had become meaningless to describe in human terms. She was, by the show's cosmology, the spirit of light and peace. This is not a metaphor. This is a literal description of her nature. She was the active, conscious presence of light in the universe. Her opposite, Vatu, was not evil in the way a villain is evil. He was the embodiment of darkness and chaos as natural forces. Together they formed the great balance. Neither could fully exist without the other. If Rava completely defeated Vatu, the darkness inside her would grow until he was reborn. The cycle had no end because balance has no end. The way Rava is depicted visually in the Legend of Korra is worth spending some time with. She is a large, luminous spirit, white with pale blue markings that resemble flowing water or light through water. She moves with a quality that is hard to describe. Not fast, not slow, something more like inevitable. When she merged with Wan at the harmonic convergence, the resulting light was the same light that glows from an avatar's eyes and tattoos in the avatar state. Every time Aang's tattoos lit up, every time his eyes opened and that white radiance poured out of him, that was Rava. She was the source of it. She was the thing the glow was made of. This is why the avatar state is not just a power boost, it is a merging. The avatar in the state is not just drawing on the memories and skills of past lives. They are becoming, more fully, the vessel they were always meant to be for a spirit that had been keeping the world in balance since before humanity drew its first breath. Rava's relationship with the avatar cycle is also its foundation. When Wan died, Rava carried his spirit and reincarnated into the next avatar. She carried within herself the accumulated memories of every avatar who had ever lived. This is why Aang could access Roku or Kyoshi. It is why those past lives had weight and presence and could speak to him. It was Rava, holding all of them inside her, making them accessible across lifetimes. But Rava could also be lost. She could be separated from the avatar. She could be diminished. And this is the terrifying and heartbreaking thing about her power. For all her age, for all her cosmic significance, she was not invulnerable. She was not all-powerful in the way that term usually implies. She was a participant in a balance, not a master of it. She could be weakened. She could be hurt. When Unalaq destroyed Rava during the harmonic convergence of 171 AG, the connection to all past avatars was severed. Every memory Rava had been carrying, every lifetime, every accumulated identity from Wan forward, was gone. The avatar cycle in that moment became less ancient than it had been. Not broken entirely, but diminished. A link to history snapped. She was reborn, because she could not be permanently destroyed. But the memories were gone. The past lives were gone. What remained was a new beginning, a second avatar age. There is something in Rava's story that operates as the show's deepest philosophical statement. She is older than anything. She has watched everything come and go, and yet she is never above partnership. Never above choosing to work alongside someone, even a young, reckless, mistake-making human who had just inadvertently released her greatest enemy. She chose to work with Wan not because she had no other option, but because she recognized something in him. The same quality that makes every avatar more than just a powerful bender. The quality of genuine intention. Power in the avatar universe is never just about strength. Rava is the proof of that. She is the oldest thing in the story. She has fought the same battle since before human civilization existed. And the reason she endures, the reason the avatar cycle persists, is not because she is undefeatable. It is because she keeps choosing to try. Fire Lord Ozai, the weight of 100 suns. Let us talk about what unchecked power looks like. What it sounds like. What it does to a room. Fire Lord Ozai never appears in action for most of Avatar, the Last Airbender. He is a presence in the shadows of his own show, a voice, a name that makes other characters go quiet, a silhouette on a throne surrounded by fire. The show withholds him almost entirely through books 1 and 2, and that withholding is one of the most effective things the production team ever did. Because by the time you finally see Ozai fight, by the time the comet red sky opens up above Wulong Forest and he steps onto his airship and begins to describe what he is about to do to the Earth Kingdom, you have already been taught to fear him without seeing a single real demonstration of his power. He is voiced by Mark Hamill, which is itself a statement. Mark Hamill is one of the most recognizable voices in the history of American storytelling. The weight of that voice, the particular quality of menace it can carry while remaining composed, was a deliberate choice. Ozai was never going to be a shouting villain. He was not going to be theatrical. He was something more unsettling than that. He was quiet. He was calm. And when he raised his hand and bent fire, the fire obeyed him so completely, so immediately, that it looked less like an act of bending and more like an act of will. His firebending was the most purely aggressive version of it in the show. Where Iroh's firebending came from inner peace and understanding, and where Azula's came from cold precision, Ozai's came from something simpler and darker: dominance. The need to be absolutely, inarguably, more than anything that stood before him. He bent fire not to balance or to protect, but to expand, to occupy more space, to make everything around him smaller by comparison. His fighting style emphasized overwhelming internal force. He could produce massive flame jets and fireballs without needing to charge them. Unlike other firebenders who needed to build momentum into a strike, Ozai could produce enormous force from a still starting position. There is a scene during his training sessions, before he is even Fire Lord, where he bends seated and the fire responds with a kind of lazy power that is somehow more frightening than a full attacking stance. He could manipulate ambient fire, the flames burning around his throne, with sheer focus. No gesture required. The fire was an extension of him in a way that most benders only approximate. He was one of only a small number of firebenders in the show capable of generating lightning. He was the only one shown capable of generating it from both hands simultaneously. That detail is not a small one. Lightning generation requires the separation of the two energies within the body, the positive and negative charges of the chi, and then their collision. Doing this requires extraordinary control. Most firebenders never attempt it because the margin for error is lethal. Ozai did it the way a bored man doodles on paper. Then Sozin's comet arrived. Sozin's comet was a celestial body that passed through the upper atmosphere of the Avatar world once every 100 years. When it did, its heat and energy bled into the atmosphere, and firebenders could harness that energy. It did not enhance their skill. It enhanced their power. The difference matters. A firebender whose form was imperfect was still imperfect with the comet. But a firebender whose form was excellent could suddenly do things that were not physically possible under any other circumstance. Fire Lord Sozin, 100 years before the events of the show, used the comet's arrival to launch his genocide of the air nomads. A fleet of Fire Nation soldiers, supercharged by comet energy, descended on the air temples simultaneously. The air nomads had no warning. They had no defense. Sozin's army, 100 times more powerful than it had been the day before, swept through. By the time the comet returned in the finale, Ozai described what it would give him as the power of 100 suns. He was not being poetic, he was being precise. Under the comet's influence, his firebending was enhanced to a level that sat above anything seen elsewhere in the show. He single-handedly produced waves of fire, larger than entire teams of regular comet-enhanced firebenders working together. His blasts could travel over enormous distances without weakening. They could shatter stone. He could use his firebending to propel himself through the air at high speed, flying without wings, sustained by controlled explosive force. He fought Aang to a standstill. Aang, who had the four elements at his disposal and also had access to the comet's enhancement of his own firebending, fought Ozai to a near-even state before Ozai managed to gain the upper hand. No other character who faced the Avatar state in a sustained battle lasted as long. Not in the whole series. The end of Ozai is its own kind of statement. Aang did not defeat him by finding a greater power. He defeated him by finding a different kind of power. Energy bending, the ability to bend the energy within another person's body, was older than all four elements. It predated the Avatar. The Lion Turtles had practiced it in the era before the Avatar cycle existed. And Aang, who had spent 3 seasons agonizing over how to stop Ozai without killing him, found the answer not in a weapon but in the oldest art of all. He reached into Ozai and took the fire away. Not the ability to feel heat, not some symbolic loss. The literal internal capacity to generate and manipulate fire, extracted and sealed by someone whose spirit was strong enough to survive the contact. Ozai spent the rest of his days as an ordinary man, aging in a cell, remembered by his son who had chosen to be something better. What Ozai represents in the show's architecture of power is important. He is not the greatest firebender because he is the most enlightened. He is the greatest firebender because he is the most willing to use fire as a tool of control, without any of the restraint that philosophy or love or grief might place on it. His power is real. It is enormous. But it is also exactly what happens when strength exists without wisdom. When the flame is everything and the warmth is nothing. He reached the ceiling of what that kind of power could do. And Aang walked through it. Azula blue fire, perfect form, and the cost of everything. She was 14 years old. This is the fact that is easiest to forget and hardest to forget at the same time. 14. The same age as 100 things that seem trivially small. The age of first homework anxieties and awkward conversations and not quite knowing what to do with your hands in photographs. And yet at 14, Azula of the Fire Nation was the most technically accomplished firebender of her generation, possibly of her century, and she was capable of things that other benders twice her age, and with decades more training could not replicate. Her fire was blue. This is the most immediately visible thing about her. In a world where firebending produces orange and red and yellow flames, Azula produced blue ones. The difference is not cosmetic. Blue fire burns at a higher temperature than orange fire. The show is encoding in her visual design an objective statement about her power. Before she speaks a word, before she demonstrates a single technique, the color of her fire tells you everything you need to know. She is operating at a different temperature than everyone around her, literally. The show later makes this more complex and more heartbreaking. As Azula descends into psychological breakdown near the end of the series, her fire becomes erratic. It flickers between blue and orange. It shoots unevenly. The color, which had always been a mark of her control and precision, becomes a mirror of her disintegration. Her fire falls apart because she is falling apart. The temperature of her emotional state is written in the heat of her flames. Her firebending was based on Northern Shaolin martial arts, the same style as other Fire Nation benders, but Azula's execution of it was distinct. Where standard Northern Shaolin emphasizes aggressive, extended movements, her version was more economical, more precise. She did not waste motion. Every strike was calculated for maximum effect with minimum effort, and that efficiency, that refusal to overspend energy, made her more dangerous than opponents who relied on force alone. She could redirect her own momentum mid-strike. She could feint with footwork that should have telegraphed one thing and deliver something entirely different. She was also one of only 3 characters in the original series capable of generating lightning. The others were Iroh and Ozai. Lightning generation requires what the show describes as a pure mind, a total separation of the two energies within the body, achieved through perfect inner stillness and precision. It is the fire-bending technique that is hardest to learn, not because of physical requirements, but because of emotional ones. You cannot generate lightning if you are conflicted. You cannot generate lightning if you are angry in an unfocused way. You must be utterly clear. Azula could generate lightning seemingly without effort. The consistency of her ability to do this spoke to a terrifying kind of clarity. Not peace, exactly. Not the inner peace that Iroh spoke about. Something colder. More like the stillness of perfect, undistracted control. She had disciplined herself into a state where nothing was allowed to disrupt the composure. Nothing from outside, and for a long time, nothing from inside. She was 14 when she conquered Ba Sing Se. Ba Sing Se, the great walled city that had never fallen. The city that had resisted the Fire Nation for the entire length of the 100-Year War. Azula took it not through a frontal assault, not through military overwhelming force, but through manipulation and intelligence. She infiltrated the Dai Li, the city's elite secret police. She turned them from agents of the Earth King into agents of the Fire Nation, and then she used their presence and influence to orchestrate a coup from within. She was 14 years old. She had no particular affection for the city or any desire to live in it. She took it because taking it was the mission, and she completed missions. She defeated Aang. In the caves beneath Ba Sing Se, she struck him with lightning while he was transitioning into the Avatar state. He died. He actually died. His heart stopped. The Avatar spirit was extinguished. Katara revived him with water from the spirit oasis at the North Pole. Water that she had been carrying for the specific reason that it had profound healing properties. But he had been dead, and Azula had done it. She had killed the Avatar. This is a fact that the show does not dwell on at length. Aang was revived before the weight of it fully settled, but for a moment, there was an Azula-shaped hole in the Avatar cycle itself. A 14-year-old girl with blue fire had hit the thing that was supposed to be unkillable and knocked it down. The psychology that built Azula is as important as the power. She was the younger child of Ozai, and Ozai's favorite. She had been raised to believe that excellence was the minimum acceptable standard, and that anything less was failure, and that failure was not something the Fire Nation had room for. Her mother Ursa had shown Zuko warmth and affection. She had shown Azula something more complicated, and in its own way more damaging. Ursa was afraid of her own daughter, afraid of the precision and the coldness in her eyes even as a small child. Azula had understood this. It had taught her that love was conditional, that it was a performance, that people's loyalty was maintained through fear and the constant threat of what would happen if you disappointed someone who had power over you. She learned to inspire fear. She was extraordinarily good at it, but she never learned to inspire love. And as the series moved toward its end, as Mai and Ty Lee, her two closest companions, chose their own consciences over her, the architecture of fear that she had built around herself showed its true cost. It kept people close through terror and drove them away the moment they were less afraid of her than they were of themselves. By the time of the final Agni Kai against Zuko, Azula was barely functional. The precision was gone. The cold clarity had shattered. She was bending in a frenzy, shooting in all directions, unstable and enormous and terrifying in a completely different way than she had been before. Her fire still burned blue, or near it, but it was uncontrolled. She summoned lightning against Zuko and he redirected it toward her, and it would have hit her if Katara had not pulled herself into its path. Katara, who used the water of the underground pipes in that courtyard to encase Azula in ice, who ended the battle not through superior firebending but through strategic intelligence and physical sacrifice. Azula was defeated. She collapsed. She screamed. And the show left her there in that moment, not dead, not redeemed, not neatly resolved. Just a girl who had been built for power and found that the building had consumed everything else there was to be. Her legacy in the show is strange and sad. She is one of the most technically powerful characters in the story. In a different life, in a world that had not required her to be what she became, she might have been extraordinary in a way that did not cost so much. But the world she was born into, and the family she was born into, and the father who saw in her all the things he wanted to be himself, those things shaped her into something remarkable and devastating in equal measure. The blue fire was always real. It was always hot, and it burned her from the inside before it ever burned anything else. Avatar Kyoshi, the immortal, the unmerciful, the island maker, she was 230 years old when she died. 230. The oldest human in the recorded history of the Avatar universe. The oldest known human, full stop. She lived so long that she watched every friend, every ally, every love she had ever formed, grow old and die and be replaced by people who had not known the previous ones. She lived through so many generations that the world she died in was essentially unrecognizable from the one she had been born into. She did not seem to mind, at least not in the way you might expect. Kyoshi was born in 312 BG in the Earth Kingdom, into poverty and circumstances that she would later describe with neither bitterness nor nostalgia. She was tall from a young age, unusually tall. As an adult, she was the tallest avatar in recorded history, with correspondingly large feet, a fact that the show itself mentions in a way that sits between admiration and amusement. She was physically imposing in a way that she learned to use deliberately. Combined with the white and green face paint she wore, derived from her parents, she became a visual presence that people did not easily forget or dismiss. She was not identified as the Avatar at the usual time. The Earth sages of her era incorrectly believed that a young man named Yun was the next Avatar in the cycle. The error was significant. It meant that Kyoshi grew up without training, without recognition, without the structure and support and sense of purpose that identification typically provided. She found her own way into her power, which is part of what made her so unusual and so dangerous. She had not been shaped by tradition because she had not had access to tradition. She had been shaped by necessity. Her earthbending was the most powerful in recorded Avatar history, with the possible exception of other avatars in the state. She could move large masses of earth with relative ease. Her strength in her native element was enormous, consistent with something the show notes across multiple characters. Earthbenders tend to live unusually long lives. King Bumi of Omashu was 112 years old at the start of the original series, and still one of the most physically formidable earthbenders in the world, his body moving with a power that seemed to draw from something deeper than muscle. Earthbending in Avatar is not just a physical art, it has a rootedness, a connection to a permanence that extends the practitioner. Kiyoshi's most famous single act was geological. She separated a peninsula from the mainland of the Earth Kingdom, creating what became known as Kyoshi Island, a body of land still visible on the map during Aang's time, 700 years after she made it. She did this during a confrontation with Qin the Conqueror, a warlord who had been steadily accumulating territory and had arrived at the peninsula demanding its submission. Kyoshi did not fight him in the traditional sense. She took the ground beneath their feet and moved it into the sea, isolating the land from the mainland entirely. Qin, who refused to retreat, fell to his death as the peninsula became an island. She never expressed regret about this. This is one of the things that makes Kyoshi so fascinating and so distinct from the other avatars we spend significant time with. She was not a pacifist. She did not approach the question of violence with the same anguish that Aang brought to it. She believed that the world required force, sometimes lethal force, and that a person in a position of responsibility who was unwilling to use that force was not noble but negligent. When Aang summoned her through the Avatar state to face the accusation that the Avatar had murdered Qin, she did not deny it. She confirmed it. She was not troubled by the label. She had done what she believed was necessary. She founded the Kyoshi Warriors, the elite group of female warriors who protected Kyoshi Island and who later trained Suki and her companions. The warriors used Tessenjutsu, the Japanese martial art of iron fans, and they wore the white makeup and green clothing that Kyoshi herself had made iconic. She gave them a purpose and a discipline and a lineage that persisted for 700 years after her own death. She founded the Dai Li. This one is more complicated. The Dai Li were originally intended to be protectors of Earth Kingdom culture and heritage. Kyoshi designed them as an elite force dedicated to preservation. What they became, under Long Feng's manipulation 200 years after her death, was an authoritarian secret police that enforced thought control in Ba Sing Se. The Dai Li who existed during Aang's time would have been unrecognizable to their founder. Kyoshi would have found them monstrous. The arc from their creation to their corruption is one of the show's quieter commentaries on how institutions built with good intentions can be hollowed out when the original vision is no longer there to defend it. The question of how Kyoshi lived so long does not have a simple canonical answer, but there are compelling theories rooted in the show's own logic. The Avatar state, when entered, does something to the body. It floods the practitioner with extraordinary energy, with the combined chi of every past life. Extended and repeated use of this state across decades might have effects on cellular processes, on the rate of aging, in ways that the show never quantifies but that the outcome suggests. Some fans point to a practice described in the Kyoshi novels as a kind of deep meditative state that may have the effect of slowing time for the practitioner's body. What is clear is that she chose, eventually, to stop. She knew how to continue. She did not continue. She had watched everyone she loved grow old and leave, and at some point the scale of that loss became something different than grief. Something heavier and quieter and more final. She let herself go. She allowed the cycle to move on. The world into which she was born had called her the most powerful human alive for 2 centuries. When she finally left it, the Earth Kingdom began to unravel from internal corruption almost immediately. The structure that she had maintained through sheer longevity and reputation had been her in many ways, and when she was gone, the absence of that structure showed. There is a line that Avatar Kyoshi delivers when she speaks through Aang, a line that has become one of the most quoted in the entire fandom. She says that she will not share her methods with him because his way of thinking is not her way of thinking. She is not offering this as a criticism. She is acknowledging a truth. Every avatar is different. Every avatar carries the whole cycle but arrives at it through their own nature. She was not Aang. Aang was not her. Both of them were right about some things. Both of them were limited by their own particular shape. She was 230 years old. She had seen everything, and she still could not see everything. Iroh, the dragon of the West, and the warmth he chose to carry. In the first episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender, Iroh seems like a joke, not a bad joke, a warm one. A harmless old man who loves tea and falls asleep in the sun and seems charmingly oblivious to the seriousness of everything happening around him. He laughs easily. He complains about tea quality with genuine feeling. He plays Pai Sho at every available opportunity and seems to find more joy in a cup of properly steeped jasmine than in any military victory. This presentation is entirely intentional, and it is entirely wrong about who he is. By the time the show reveals what Iroh actually is, what he has done and what he has chosen and what he can do when he stops pretending to be a harmless old man, the effect is something close to awe. Not the awe of pure power, though his power is genuine. Something subtler. The awe of a person who could have been the most terrifying thing in the room and chose, deliberately and at significant personal cost, to be something else. Iroh was the crown prince of the Fire Nation. Not Ozai. Iroh. He was the firstborn son of Fire Lord Azulon, which meant the throne was his by right, by heritage, and in the eyes of the Fire Nation, by destiny. He was also a military commander of extraordinary reputation. His title, the Dragon of the West, was earned, and what it meant matters. He had supposedly killed the last dragon. Dragons were the original firebenders. Fire Lord Sozin had begun the tradition of hunting them, and over the course of the 100-Year War they had been killed to near extinction. Their killers received the honorary title of Dragon, the highest honor a Fire Nation soldier could earn, because to kill the original Master of Fire was to claim mastery over fire itself. Iroh was the Dragon of the West because everyone believed he had slain the last two dragons. He had not. Ran and Shaw, the last two dragons, were alive. Iroh had found them at the hidden city of the Sun Warriors, the ancient civilization that had originally learned firebending from dragons, the civilization that everyone else believed extinct. He had presented himself to the dragons, who judged him worthy. They had taught him the true nature of fire, not the rage-fueled, aggressive, conquest-driven firebending that the Fire Nation had devolved into over a century of war. The original understanding. Fire as life. Fire as energy. Fire as the same force that moves through every living thing. And then Iroh had told the world that he killed the dragons, so that no one would come looking for them. He kept the secret for the rest of his life. He never corrected the record. He accepted the title and the honor, while knowing that the honor was built on a lie he had told to protect something beautiful. What he received from Ran and Shaw changed his firebending at a fundamental level. Unlike his brother Ozai, unlike his niece Azula, Iroh did not draw his fire from anger or from the drive to dominate. He drew it from what the dragons had shown him. The inner warmth. The life in the flame. When his firebending appeared in full force in the show, it was accompanied by a quality that the other Fire Nation benders never had. It looked alive in a way theirs did not. His most famous technique was not something he had inherited or been taught in a traditional sense. It was something he invented. Lightning redirection. Lightning generation was already known to a handful of elite firebenders. Ozai could do it. Azula could do it with her eyes closed. The technique worked by separating the two energies within the body, positive and negative, holding them apart with perfect precision, and then allowing their collision to produce the bolt. The requirement was a perfectly still mind, no conflict, no wavering. Iroh looked at this technique and saw something interesting. The lightning, once generated, had to go somewhere. If it hit a person who was unprepared, it went straight to the heart and killed them. But Iroh had been watching waterbenders. He had been studying the way they redirected force, how they used circular movements and the principles of flow to take an incoming attack and send it back out along a different vector. He asked himself whether that principle could be applied to lightning. He spent years working out the answer. The technique he developed was an act of cross-disciplinary imagination. It used firebending as the base skill, but incorporated waterbending philosophy. The lightning enters through one hand, flows through the stomach, and exits through the other hand, passing through the body along the energy pathways without touching the heart if the redirection is performed correctly. The margin for error is lethal. If your focus slips, if the path deviates toward the heart, you die. Iroh was the only person who could redirect natural lightning. A bolt from the sky, uncontrolled and enormously powerful, aimed at no one and carrying the full force of an actual atmospheric discharge. He demonstrated this in a scene that the show presents as matter of fact, as if he is simply doing something he has practiced until it is no longer remarkable. He was also the only person shown capable of redirecting Azula's lightning before she had fully released it, cutting the bolt off mid-generation and sending it back. This required a level of timing and attunement that goes beyond technique into something harder to name. He could generate lightning himself, from a position of inner peace rather than from Azula's cold precision or Ozai's domineering focus. He could breathe fire with the intensity that earned him his title, a technique called the breath of fire that he could sustain with potency enough to overpower multiple opponents. He blasted through the inner wall of Ba Sing Se when the Order of the White Lotus liberated the city, producing a single fire blast of sufficient force to breach a structure designed to withstand sustained military assault. He did this alone, calmly, like he was knocking on a door. His involvement in the Order of the White Lotus is his other great contribution. The Order was an ancient and secret society of masters who had transcended the boundaries of national loyalty, who saw themselves as servants of humanity rather than of any single nation. Its members included Bumi, Paku, Piandao. Its symbol was the white lotus tile from Pai Shou. Its purpose, in Iroh's hands, became the liberation of Ba Sing Se. He assembled the members. He coordinated the operation. He walked through the gates of a conquered city, backed by a group of old men and women who had spent their lives becoming the best versions of what they were, and together they drove the Fire Nation occupiers out. The Jasmine Dragon, the tea shop he opened in Ba Sing Se during his time undercover. Named after Jasmine Dragon Pearl Tea, a high-quality Chinese green tea associated with refinement, patience, and the appreciation of the subtle. The name was not an accident. It was Iroh placing his values in the title of the thing he built: refinement, patience, subtlety. A warm place where someone could come in from the cold and have something good to drink. He was the most powerful firebender of his time, with the possible exception of a comet-enhanced Ozai. The distinction, the thing that made him different from his brother and his niece, was that he knew what fire was for. Not conquest, not dominance. Life, warmth, the inner sun. He carried that knowledge gently, like a cup of tea held in both hands. Toph Beifong, the girl who broke the rules of what was possible. She was 12 years old. She was blind since birth. She weighed less than half of most of the people she defeated. And she was the greatest earthbender who had ever lived. This is not a statement of sentiment. It is a statement of fact that the show earns through demonstration rather than declaration. Toph Beifong was born into one of the wealthiest families in the Earth Kingdom. Her parents, Lao and Poppy Beifong, had constructed her life around protection. She was fragile, they believed. She was their only child and she could not see, and the world was dangerous, and so they kept her inside and hid her from it. They introduced her to guests as a daughter who was meek and refined and delicate. They did not know what their daughter did at night. At night, she went to the underground arena. The Earth Rumble tournaments were not polite competitions. They were the full-contact sport of earthbending, held in a stone pit below the surface of the Earth Kingdom, attended by crowds who wanted to see boulders shatter and opponents fall, and power demonstrated in its most direct form. Toph had been competing in them under the name The Blind Bandit. She had never lost. She fought differently from every other earthbender in the show. Her style was based on southern praying mantis kung fu rather than the hung gar that most earthbenders used. Hung gar, with its wide, low-rooted stances and its direct, powerful strikes, was considered the natural fit for Earth because it mirrored the philosophy of the element. Stable, immovable, heavy. But Toph could not use those wide stances. She was small, her reach was limited, and crucially, her blindness changed her relationship with the ground in a way that no sighted earthbender could fully understand. For Toph, the ground was not a stage on which she fought. It was her vision. Every vibration that moved through the earth, every footfall and heartbeat and breath that changed the pressure on the stone, came to her through her feet and gave her a picture of her surroundings more complete than most sighted people ever receive. She called it seismic sense. Through the soles of her feet, she could feel the shape of the land around her with extraordinary precision. She could detect enemies approaching from hundreds of meters away. She could feel the internal structure of objects, not just their surfaces but their composition, their density, the way their materials were arranged. She could detect heartbeats and identify when someone was lying by the changes in their physiological response, making her a living, involuntary lie detector. The seismic sense was also what enabled the greatest single act of earthbending innovation in the entire Avatar universe. Toph invented metal bending. For the entire history of the show's world, metal had been considered unbendable. This was not a matter of insufficient skill. It was considered a logical impossibility. Metal was earth that had been refined, purified, processed far beyond its natural state. The impurities that gave earthbenders purchase on their material had been removed. Earthbending worked by connecting with the natural impure earth. Metal, by that logic, had no earth in it to connect with. King Bumi, one of the most formidable earthbenders in the world and a man who had once bent an enormous quantity of rock using only his face, could not bend metal. The whole system of Fire Nation earthbender capture was built around metal cages specifically because of this limitation. Toph was captured in one of these cages. She was being transported by Master Yu and a man named Xin Fu, who had been hired by her father to bring her home. She was in a small metal box suspended above the ground, which meant her seismic sense was also cut off. No connection to Earth below meant no vision of any kind. She spent time in the dark. Then she started hitting the walls. Through the vibrations she sent into the metal, she began to feel something. Not Earth in any obvious sense, but something. Trace amounts of unrefined material, tiny impurities that had survived the refining process. Fragments of raw earth still present in the metal because no refining process is ever perfectly complete. She found those fragments with her seismic sense. She connected to them. She bent them. The metal responded. She bent the cage apart from the inside and walked out. She had invented an entirely new art. She had looked at the walls of the impossible and found a door in them because her perception was fine-grained enough to detect what no one else had ever noticed was there. After the events of the show, Toph founded the Baifeng Metal Bending Academy, the first institution devoted to teaching the art she had invented. She trained other earthbenders to perceive what she could perceive. The academy students went on to form the Metal Bending Police Force of Republic City, the institution that her daughter Lin would later lead. A whole lineage of innovation had grown from one girl in a metal box in the dark who decided that impossible was a word for people who had not looked carefully enough. Her fighting style and practice was deceptive in the best possible way. She stood still more than most fighters. She waited. She let opponents move toward her, reading their approach through the ground, making micro-adjustments to her stance, timing her response with the patience of someone for whom movement is not about seeing an opening but about feeling one. When she struck, the strikes were compact and decisive. She conserved energy ruthlessly and spent it only when she was certain of the effect. She once held up the walls of an enormous library as it was dragged into the spirit world. She did this alone, in sand, which disrupted her seismic sense and effectively blinded her entirely, while simultaneously being unable to prevent Appa's kidnapping because she could not feel what was happening above her, only below. She held up tons of stone as long as she physically could. When she finally had to let go, it was because her body gave out, not her earthbending. There is a small detail about Toph that the show includes without ever commenting on. When the group camps for the night, Toph sleeps with her feet elevated. She props them against a rock or a raised bit of earth. She does this because her seismic sense is always on. If her feet are touching the ground while she sleeps, she feels everything within her range. Every footstep, every animal, every shift in the earth. Sleeping would be impossible. Lifting her feet is the equivalent of closing her eyes. The show never mentions this. It is just there, in frame, in scene after scene. A detail so carefully placed and so completely unexplained that it works as both a piece of characterization and a small gift to anyone watching closely enough. She was 12 years old. She was the best earthbender alive. She invented a new art. And she slept with her feet up so she could rest her eyes. Avatar Kyoshi's counterpart. Zuko and the dragon's fire returned to its source. There is a moment in Book 3 of Avatar, The Last Airbender, where Zuko, who has been training Aang in firebending, discovers that his power has significantly diminished. He cannot understand why. He is doing everything right. He is using the forms, he is generating heat, but the fire that comes from his hands is weak and thin, and nothing like what he had been capable of before. He goes to Aang with the problem and neither of them understands it. A conversation with Zuko's former master, an old firebending teacher named Zhong Zhong, who had long ago abandoned the Fire Nation's way of bending, provides a direction, and that direction leads them both to the Sun Warriors. The Sun Warriors were supposed to be extinct, an ancient civilization that had been the original human firebenders, the first people to learn the art directly from dragons. They had retreated from the world long before the 100-Year War, hiding their existence, maintaining their traditions in secret, watching the Fire Nation transform what they had built into something unrecognizable. The transformation was real and it mattered. Over the course of the 100-Year War, Fire Nation firebending had become an art of aggression. The philosophy behind it had shifted. Fire was not life and energy and warmth. Fire was conquest. Fire was superiority. Fire was what made the Fire Nation better than the nations it was burning. This philosophical corruption had physical effects. Firebenders drawing on rage and the need to dominate were producing powerful fire, but they were drawing from a limited and self-destructive source. The inner fire that Iroh described, the fire that came from the same place as the dragon's fire, was not rage. Rage was a shortcut that worked until it didn't. Zuko's power had diminished because he had spent his entire life drawing on rage, on shame, on the need to prove himself to a father who was constitutionally incapable of being satisfied. When he changed sides, when he chose Aang and the group and everything they represented, the rage that had been his fuel was simply no longer there. He was not angry the way he had been. He was still conflicted and still uncertain, but the specific fire that had powered his bending was no longer burning. He needed a different source. The Sun Warriors sent Zuko and Aang to the firebending masters. The actual masters, not instructors or scholars, but the original teachers of the art, Ran and Shaw, 2 dragons, the last 2. Living in secret at the sun-blessed peak, judging each person who was brought before them worthy or unworthy of the knowledge they held. Iroh had been to them. He had learned from them, and then told the world he killed them so that no one else would come looking, so that they could continue to exist in peace. He had kept their secret for decades. He had taken their teaching and made it the foundation of the firebending philosophy that he then spent years trying to pass on to Zuko. Zuko and Aang carried pieces of the eternal flame up the mountain. The flame that the Sun Warriors had maintained since the beginning of their civilization. The flame that had come originally from the dragons themselves. When Ran and Shaw emerged, enormous and ancient and moving with a flowing grace that bore no resemblance to the aggressive lunge of Fire Nation military firebending, they created a whirlwind of fire around Zuko and Aang. But the fire was not orange. It was every color. Red, gold, blue, green, white, a full spectrum of fire that moved in spiraling columns, that surrounded without burning, that felt less like a weapon and more like something alive expressing itself. Zuko understood. He said, "It is like the sun, but inside of you." He had lost sight of his inner fire. The rage that had powered his bending had been a replacement for it. A crutch. A source that worked but that was borrowed rather than genuine. His inner fire was something else. His desire to bring balance. His love for his uncle. His grief for his mother. His commitment to doing what was right even when it was costly. These were not weaknesses. They were the actual fuel. The dragons had known it for longer than human civilization had existed. His firebending after this moment was different. Not more powerful in a raw sense, not right away. But it was his in a way it had not been before. It came from the right place. And fire that comes from the right place does not run out when the anger does. Zuko's development as a firebender across 3 seasons is one of the most carefully plotted arcs in the show. He starts as a deeply skilled but philosophically misaligned practitioner. His anger makes him strong but also makes him predictable. His sense of shame pushes him to overextend. He cannot generate lightning because his mind is too conflicted. Iroh tries to teach him and cannot, and watches with a sadness that comes from understanding exactly why his nephew cannot learn what he is trying to teach. Zuko eventually learns to redirect lightning, which in some ways matters more than learning to generate it. Lightning redirection requires the same inner clarity that lightning generation does, but what it produces is different. It does not destroy. It redirects. It takes something aimed at you and sends it somewhere else. This technique, built on waterbending philosophy and a firebending frame, was the perfect expression of who Zuko was becoming. A person who had survived enormous force directed at him and learned to move it through himself instead of absorbing it. He faced his father in the day of Black Sunday. Ozai shot lightning at him. He redirected it. The lightning arced back and Ozai dodged. Zuko turned and walked away. He had passed a test that had nothing to do with firebending and everything to do with it. His firebending after the dragons was not the same fire as before. But it was more fully his than it had ever been. And it came from a source that would not go out. Aang in the Avatar state, every life that ever lived, living in one body. In the Northern Air Temple, when Aang finds the frozen form of Monk Gyatso and understands what happened to the air nomads, the Avatar state activates involuntarily. He does not choose it. He does not calm himself into it. He is hit by grief so total and so sudden that his body cannot contain it. And the thing that lives inside him, the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of avatars who came before him, responds. His eyes and tattoos go white. The air around him begins to move, and the sound, the layered, harmonizing chord that the show's composer Jeremy Zuckerman created specifically for the Avatar state by combining all four nations' musical palettes into a single dissonant convergence, fills the space. He is not just Aang anymore in those moments. He is Wan and Kyoshi and Roku and Kuruk and Yangchen and every avatar before them, all of them present simultaneously in one 12-year-old body, all of them channeling their knowledge and their power through him. The glowing eyes are Rava. That is what the white light is. Rava, seen through the eyes of a vessel that has become transparent to her presence. The Avatar state is the most powerful state any human being in the Avatar universe can enter. It is not just an enhancement of the Avatar's existing abilities. It is the overlay of every bending master who has ever lived onto one person's form. When Aang enters the Avatar state, he has access to the water bending of masters who trained for decades in the polar seas. He has the earth bending of avatars who spent lifetimes underground. He has the fire bending of every avatar who was born in the Fire Islands. He has the air bending, which is the art he was born to, refined across 10,000 years by every airborne avatar in the cycle. The result, when it is fully expressed, looks like the world itself is bending. In the siege of the Northern Water Tribe, when Admiral Zhao killed the Moon Spirit, the Ocean Spirit, Tui and La's counterpart, La, sought a vessel for its grief and rage. It merged with Aang. The result was not an avatar state in the traditional sense. It was something else, a human body carrying the combined presence of the Avatar spirit and the Ocean Spirit, moving through the Fire Nation fleet like a force of nature. Ships were picked up, soldiers were scattered. The sheer volume of water being moved was enough to reshape the harbor. The sound designers created a unique audio profile for this merged entity. Not Aang's voice, not any voice the show had used before. Something that combined human vocalization with ocean sounds, low-frequency rumbles, the distant calls of large sea creatures. It was designed to communicate on a level below language. Not a character speaking, something older than characters. But the Avatar state has a cost. It always has. If an avatar is killed while in the Avatar state, the cycle ends. The spirit is extinguished. No reincarnation. No next avatar. The chain that began with Wan and Rava 10,000 years before, maintained across every lifetime that followed, broken irreparably. This is why the state's power and the state's danger are inseparable. It is the fullest expression of the Avatar's ability and the point of maximum vulnerability simultaneously. Azula understood this. When she struck Aang in the caves beneath Ba Sing Se, he was transitioning into the Avatar state. The lightning hit him at the moment of maximum exposure. He died. Katara revived him with her spirit oasis water, and the cycle continued. But for a moment it had not. Aang's journey to mastering the Avatar state is the inner story of the show beneath the outer story of mastering the four elements. He could enter the state involuntarily from early in Book 1. He could not control it. He could not choose to enter it or exit it. He could not direct it. It moved through him rather than being wielded by him, and this distinction mattered enormously. A power you cannot control is not entirely yours. It is a force that uses you as a channel, and the channel has no say in where the force goes. The Guru Pathik's teaching about the chakras was Aang's attempt to unlock conscious control, opening the 7 chakras, clearing the blocked energy pathways, allowing the cosmic energy of the universe to flow through him without resistance. 6 of the 7 chakras he opened. The 7th, the thought chakra, required letting go of earthly attachment. In the context of the story, it required letting go of his attachment to Katara. He could not do it. He chose her. He left the state locked. It was not until Ozai, in the finale, struck Aang's injured back against a rock and inadvertently pressed on the wound in a way that released the blocked energy and forced the final chakra open, that the Avatar state became Aang's to control. He entered it consciously. He directed it. He chose to leave it. The scene of Aang, fully in the Avatar state, facing Ozai under the comet's light, is the visual climax the entire show had been building toward. But what follows it is the true resolution. Aang stops. He does not finish with force. He remembers the lion turtle. He exits the state. He chooses a different kind of power. Energy bending. The ability to bend the energy within another person's body. Not a new element. The original art. The art the lion turtles used before the elements were given to humans. Aang, who had been given this knowledge by the last lion turtle in his own sleepwalking visitation, used it on Ozai while no longer in the avatar state. He used it as himself, as Aang the monk and airbender, not as the cosmic convergence of every avatar who had ever lived. This is important because it means the most powerful thing Aang did in the entire show was not done in the avatar state. It was done as himself. A 12-year-old boy with the unwillingness to kill, with the values of the air nomads pressed into him by people who had loved him, with the specific commitment to life that his culture had built into the foundation of his personality. His spirit was strong enough to perform energy bending, not because he was the avatar, but because he was Aang. The avatar state is the power the role gives you. The energy bending was the power the person earned. He used both. But the one that mattered most was the second. Katara, the last waterbender of the South and the full weight of water. In the first episode of Avatar, The Last Airbender, Katara performs a small piece of waterbending and accidentally cracks the hull of a water tribe boat. Her brother Sokka complains. She apologizes. The water she has bent is about the volume of a barrel, and controlling it costs her visible effort. By the end of the series, she is throwing colossal waves with enough force to disorient warships. She is extracting water from the humidity of the air itself when no other source is available. She is healing wounds that should be fatal, drawing on techniques she learned in a single session at the North Pole and developed independently through the rest of the series. She is bloodbending under a full moon with enough precision to stop a person mid-movement, to control the fluid in their muscles and veins with terrifying exactness. She got from the beginning to the end in roughly 1 year of story time. Katara's arc as a bender is one of the most complete in the series, because it is not just about power. It is about the different things water can be, and how the full spectrum of what water is reflects the full spectrum of who she is. She was the last waterbender in the Southern Water Tribe, the only one. Every other waterbender in the South had been taken or killed in Fire Nation raids conducted over decades, specifically to eliminate Southern Water Tribe bending ability. The raids were systematic and they were thorough. Katara was left because she was young and because she had not yet fully developed her ability, and the raiders did not recognize what they were looking at. She was also the person who watched her mother die at the hands of a Fire Nation soldier named Yan Ra, who was looking specifically for a waterbender. Her mother, Kia, told Yan Ra that she was the waterbender. She was not. She sacrificed herself to protect her daughter, and Katara, hiding, heard everything. This is the wound that runs beneath every other thing Katara does in the show. The grief and the anger and the long, complicated relationship with the question of what to do when someone has taken something irreplaceable from you, and you could, if you chose to, take something back. Her training came from multiple sources. She had the stolen waterbending scroll early in Book 1, which described real Tai Chi forms in the show's animation style. She learned what she could from it on her own. She then received formal training from Master Pakku at the Northern Water Tribe, though not before she challenged him to a duel when he refused to teach her, because she was a woman. She held her own against a master for long enough to be noticed. When Pakku learned that her grandmother was the woman he had loved and lost before she left for the Southern Tribe, he agreed to teach her. She became a full master of waterbending through the combination of formal training from one of the best instructors in the world and years of constant real-world practice in conditions that did not allow for comfortable refinement. She did not have a training hall. She practiced while traveling on a flying bison through a war. She learned by needing to. Bloodbending is the darkest part of her story and the most honestly told. Hama was an old woman living in a Fire Nation village. She appeared gentle. She told stories and made warm food and seemed like the kind of person the village had grown comfortable with. She was a Southern Water Tribe waterbender who had survived Fire Nation capture decades before by escaping from prison through a technique she had developed in the dark. She had discovered that the human body is mostly water, and water is water. She had learned, under the full moon when her power was at its strongest, to extend her waterbending into the water inside living things, into blood, into the fluid in muscles and joints, into the biological water that makes up the majority of every living body. And once she could reach that water, she could move it. She could make a person's arm rise. She could make them walk forward or backward. She could make them turn. They could not resist. Their will was irrelevant. It is an extraordinarily violent idea dressed in clinical language. It is also, within the show's internal logic, consistent. Water is water wherever it is. The reason no one had discovered this before was not that it was beyond the technical limits of waterbending. It was that no waterbender in history had been desperate enough, imprisoned enough, locked in enough darkness for long enough, to look at their own body and think, the water is in there too. Hama taught it to Katara, who was horrified, who swore she would never use it, who was then forced to use it on Hama herself in their confrontation, which Hama orchestrated specifically so that Katara would have to, so that Katara would know the feeling, so that she would have to live with the knowledge that she could do this. She used it once more in the Southern Raiders. She and Zuko tracked down Yon-Ra, the man who had killed her mother. They found him. She had the power to end him. She bloodbended him for a brief moment, lifting his body with the water in his veins, holding him powerless. And then she stopped. She let him go. She walked away. She did not forgive him. She was clear about that. She did not pretend that what he had done was something that could be forgiven. But she chose not to be the person who ended it with his death. She chose to carry it differently. This moment, which the show presents without score or ornamentation, is arguably the most powerful thing Katara does in the entire series. Not the warships, not the healing, not the bloodbending. The moment when she had the power and the grief and the right and she put it down, Korra, years later, would describe Katara as the best waterbender in the world. Not the most powerful in the sense of raw bending volume, the most skilled, the most complete, the most fully realized practitioner of the element, the person who understood what water could be in every sense. In combat, she could produce waves that no other waterbender in the series matched for size. She could form ice instantaneously and precisely, freezing opponents mid-movement or creating barriers in seconds. She could bend water from the air itself when no liquid source was available. She escaped from Fire Nation capture by waterbending the sweat from her own skin, an act of improvisational precision that required sensitivity to something vanishingly small. She understood water at a molecular level through practice and intuition rather than study. And she healed. This is the part of her bending that is easy to undervalue because it does not look impressive in the way that combat techniques do. But the healing she practiced was the result of her connection to the water in living tissue, which is also what made bloodbending available to her. The same sensitivity that let her reach inside a body and take hold of its blood also let her reach inside a body and encourage it to repair itself. She pulled the poison from a man's body. She healed wounds that had already begun to close incorrectly. She maintained the life of an unconscious Aang for long enough that he survived what should have been fatal. She was not born the most powerful waterbender in the world. She became it through necessity and grief and stubbornness and a particular quality of devotion to her element that made her willing to understand it completely, including the parts that frightened her. She was the last waterbender of the Southern tribe. By the time the war ended, she was something more than that. The architecture of power and what it was always about. If you step back from all of them and look at them together, a pattern emerges that the show is not subtle about, but that is easy to miss anyway, because you are usually too close to any one of them to see the whole shape. Every person on this list is powerful, genuinely, measurably powerful in ways the show demonstrates through action rather than claim. But not one of them is the most powerful in a simple, uncomplicated sense. They are all powerful in ways that come with conditions, with costs, with the specific character of who they are baked into the nature of what they can do. Rava is older than everything but can be separated and diminished and was once, briefly, destroyed. Wan created the Avatar cycle but died before he felt he had done enough. Ozai had the power of 100 suns and used every bit of it to make the world smaller. Azula was a prodigy of prodigies and fell apart at 14 because the thing that made her strongest also made everything else hollow. Kyoshi lived for 230 years and outlasted everyone she loved. Iroh was the most powerful firebender of his era and chose to be a tea shop owner. Toph invented a new branch of bending and remained, in her own estimation, unremarkable about the whole thing. Aang had every life that had ever lived available to him and chose, when it mattered most, to act as only himself. Katara held the most frightening power waterbending has ever produced and chose, in the most important moment, not to use it. The show is consistent about this in a way that rewards the attention you are giving it right now, in the dark, with the night settled around you. Power in Avatar is not about how much fire you can make or how much earth you can move. It is about the relationship between the bender and the element. about whether the person understands what the element is and what it is for. The original firebenders were dragons who bent life and light. The original earthbenders were badger moles who bent the world as it was. The original waterbenders learned from the moon, which pulls and releases and never tries to hold the sea in place. The original airbenders were sky bison, who moved as if gravity was a suggestion. The most powerful practitioners in the show are the ones who most fully understand this. Iroh, who found in the dragon's fire a warmth that survived the loss of his son. Toph, who found in the earth's resistance a permission to be unmovable in herself. Katara, who found in water's capacity to change states a model for how to be soft and strong in different moments. Aang, who found in air's emptiness not a lack but a freedom. And the ones who are undone by their power are the ones who forget the origin. Ozai, who used fire to consume and never to illuminate. Azula, whose fire was beautiful and cold and served no warmth. The show made this world with extraordinary care. It hid real martial arts inside every fight. It hid real philosophy inside every lesson. It hid real astronomy inside the siege of the North Pole, and real geology inside Kyoshi Island, and real psychology inside every character who fell apart or put themselves back together. What you feel right now, the weight of this world settling over you like something comfortable and familiar, is the result of that care. 1,000 decisions made by people who believed that the thing you could not quite name mattered just as much as the thing you could. The calligraphy you cannot read. The lunar cycle you did not track. The sleeping position of a blind girl who had to lift her feet to close her eyes. All of it was built for this. For the feeling that a world this specific and this full could exist somewhere just past the edge of the screen, waiting for you to go back. You have been carrying this world with you since you first watched it. It was always carrying something back. Let the breathing slow now. Let the characters stay where they are. Wan at the spirit portal. Rava moving through the ages like light through deep water. Ozai watching the comet arrive. Azula at 14, with her blue fire and her perfect form. Kyoshi, older than anyone, making the choice to stay just a little longer. Iroh with his tea in both hands. Toph with her feet off the ground. Aang somewhere between all the lives he has carried. Katara by the water, holding the thing she will not use. They are all still there. They will be there the next time you come back. Sleep well. If you are here, if you made it this far through the dark, then thank you. Genuinely. Leave a like if this helped you find your way to sleep tonight. And subscribe so you are here for the next one. There are always more rooms in this world than any one visit can cover. There is always something left to find. Baldhead lore. Subscribe for more deep dives into the worlds that lived inside us before we knew what to call them. Extended meditations going deeper into each of them. Because there is always more. There is always another room. Wan, again what it cost to be the first. The thing about Wan that the show presents in the 2 Legend of Korra episodes dedicated to his story, Beginnings Part 1 and Part 2, is how ordinary he was before everything changed. He was not chosen. He was not prophesied. He did not have a lineage of great warriors behind him or an ancient teacher who recognized his potential from across a crowded room. He was a young man in a lower caste on the back of a giant turtle, and the thing that set him apart was not talent. It was a refusal to accept that the world had to be the way it was. The Chu family in his city controlled everything. They controlled access to the lion turtle's gift of fire. They controlled the food. They controlled who ate and who did not. Wan stole from them repeatedly and distributed what he stole to the people around him who were hungry. He was not subtle about it, and he was not particularly effective. He got caught. He always got caught. But he kept doing it, which is its own kind of statement about who he was before he was anything else. When he was banished into the spirit wilds, his first instinct was to survive. His second instinct was to look around. He was in a place that had been described to him his entire life as dangerous and hostile and other. And he found that the spirits living there were not exactly as advertised. Some of them were genuinely dangerous. Some of them were simply going about their existence, and when Wan approached them without aggression or fear, a significant number of them were simply curious in return. He spent 2 years learning to live there. He learned the names and natures of dozens of spirits. He learned which ones were territorial and which ones were friendly, and which ones were neither and simply wanted to be left alone. He learned to communicate not through words, because most spirits did not use words in any form he recognized, but through presence and consistency, and the slow accumulation of trust that comes from showing up in the same way every day until something decides you can be trusted. This was good training for what he was about to become. The Avatar's job, in its original conception, was to maintain balance between the human and spirit worlds. You cannot do that job if you are afraid of one side of the equation. You cannot do it if you treat one side as other. Wan learned the spirit world by living inside it, and this gave him something no avatar who came after him had in quite the same way. He had been a resident, not a visitor with special access, but an actual inhabitant of the spirit wilds, shaped by the experience the way any place shapes you if you live there long enough. The moment when Wan was tricked by Vaatu haunts the two episodes in a way that makes them more interesting than a simple origin story. He was not stupid. He was not reckless. He was compassionate. He saw what looked like a large, powerful spirit being restrained by a smaller one, and he responded to it the way a person who had learned to care about spirits would respond. He freed the smaller one from the larger one's grip. He thought he was helping. The show is careful not to frame this as a simple mistake. It is not carelessness or arrogance. It is Wan's goodness, his orientation toward protection and fairness, being exploited by something that understood exactly what he was and used it against him. Vaatu was not just powerful, he was intelligent. He knew that the most reliable way to manipulate a person with strong values is to present the situation to them in a way that makes the harmful choice look like the ethical one. The guilt Wan carried from that moment was not the self-flagellating kind that paralyzes people. It was the active kind. The kind that says, I cannot undo this, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to counterbalance it. He did not sit down in the wilds and mourn what he had done. He found Rava, who was now weakened and alone and facing a threat she could not fully contain, and he said, I will help you fix this. Tell me what I need to learn. The year that followed was his actual education, not the 2 years in the spirit wilds, which taught him to survive and to understand the spirit world's nature. The year with Rava, moving from lion turtle to lion turtle, learning each new element under the constraint that Rava could only hold one at a time for him, having to give each one back to her before receiving the next one, was the year that made him into something that had not existed before. He was the first person to bend more than one element while retaining the memory and understanding of each one. When he held fire, he was a firebender. When he had to give the fire back to Rava so she could carry air for him, he was temporarily not a bender at all, just a person walking through a dangerous world. When he received air, he was an airbender. The elements came and went, but Wan's understanding of each one, the time he had spent with it, the relationship he had built with it, remained. This is the philosophical foundation of what the Avatar is. Not a person who can control 4 things simultaneously because of some inborn cosmic power. A person who has genuinely understood each element in its own right and can move between understandings the way a musician moves between instruments without losing fluency in any of them. The harmonic convergence was the deadline. 1 year. If they were not ready by then, Vaatu would win. There was no extension available. The universe does not offer those. When Wan placed his hand on the spirit portal and permanently merged with Rava, he was not making a heroic sacrifice in any obvious way. He was not giving up something to save something else. He was choosing to be something new rather than something familiar. The person who had grown up on the lion turtle's back, who had been banished and lived in the wilds and made friends with spirits and accidentally freed chaos into the world, was choosing to become something that had never existed before, part human and part spirit, the person and the ancient being combined. He used the comet's enhanced spiritual energy that the harmonic convergence generated, and the merging completed. And what came out of it was the avatar state, that first activation, that first blaze of white light, the power of all 4 elements in one body, guided by the soul of a young man who had started all of this by stealing fire from a lion turtle to feed his hungry neighbors. He sealed Vaatu in the Tree of Time. He closed the spirit portals. He spent the rest of his life trying to bring peace to a world that was still learning what peace looked like after a lifetime of conflict between humans and spirits. His last battlefield was an earthbending war. He died surrounded by the giant stone coins that earthbenders used as siege weapons. He died not having finished. He told Rava as much. She told him the cycle was beginning. He lived approximately 20 years as the Avatar. 20 years for someone who had been born into a world with no avatar, who had spent 2 years surviving in the spirit wilds, who had spent 1 year learning 4 elements in partnership with an ancient spirit, who had defeated the spirit of darkness and chaos and sealed it in a tree, who had then spent the remaining time of his life trying to use the power he had created for something good. He did not have enough time. He said so clearly. The avatar cycle, the fact that Rava would carry his spirit into the next person who was born in the next element of the rotation, was both his legacy and his acknowledgement that one lifetime was not sufficient to do everything the world needed. No lifetime ever is. That is the point of a cycle. Azula's 14, the mathematics of prodigy. Most firebending masters achieve their status after decades of training. Ozai had been bending his entire life. Iroh had trained extensively before he ever achieved the level of power he was known for, and his deeper development came from the decades-long spiritual transformation that followed his son's death and his own eventual enlightenment through Ran and Shaw. Azula was a fully formed master at 14. This fact is presented in the show with a matter-of-factness that is itself almost frightening. She is not treated as exceptional within the show's narrative in the sense of being a wonder that characters marvel at. She is exceptional in the way that a natural disaster is exceptional. She is simply what she is, and the people around her adjust accordingly. She had been identifying her own tactical errors since she was small. She did not learn from her father's praise. She learned from her own analysis of her own performance. She set the standard internally and then compared her work to it, and when the work fell short of the standard she had set, she corrected herself. Ozai never needed to punish her for failure because she was ahead of him. She had already identified the failure, already understood its cause, already made the adjustment. This is the thing that made her such an effective military commander at an age when most people are still learning how to navigate high school hallways. She did not have the emotional noise that interferes with clear assessment. She could look at a situation, identify its components, predict the likely behavior of every person in it, and select the most efficient path to her objective. She did this across multiple scenarios simultaneously because her mind was structured to hold multiple threads without tangling them. The capture of Ba Sing Se is the best demonstration of this at scale. The city had walls that the Fire Nation had been failing to breach for the entirety of the 100-Year War. Every frontal assault had failed. Every siege had eventually been broken. Ba Sing Se was a logistical fortress, a cultural institution, a symbol of Earth Kingdom resistance that had been maintained for 100 years specifically because the people defending it had never given it up from the inside. Azula did not attack the walls. She walked through the gate. She had identified the Dai Li as the city's true power structure before she arrived. She understood that the Earth King was a figurehead maintained by Long Feng, the head of the Dai Li, who used the organization's control of information to keep the king ignorant of the war and therefore controllable. She approached Long Feng not as an enemy but as a potential partner, offering him something he actually wanted. She then, carefully and methodically, made herself so valuable to the Dai Li that they transferred their loyalty from Long Feng to her before Long Feng fully understood what was happening. Long Feng tried to reassert control over the Dai Li in their final confrontation. He told them that their loyalty was to the organization and to him. Azula looked at the assembled agents and calmly informed them that their loyalty was now to her, and that they could recognize this or they could be removed. She watched them choose her. Long Feng, seeing the choice in their faces, made the only rational conclusion available to him and conceded. He told her she had beaten him at his own game. She replied that she was surprised it took that long. She was 14 years old. The cost of this kind of ability is what the show spends its time on in the later episodes. Azula's mind was structured to hold multiple threads without tangling them, but it was also structured in a way that treated all of those threads as problems to be solved, as variables to be managed, as resources or threats or tools. She did not experience people the way that people are generally experienced. She experienced them the way a commander experiences a battlefield. Every person in her life was a factor to be assessed, a loyalty to be measured, a potential point of failure to be monitored. This made her extraordinarily effective, and it made her deeply alone. When Mai and Tai Li made their choices, when they demonstrated that their loyalty to their own values was stronger than their fear of Azula's consequences, something broke in her model of the world. The model said that loyalty was maintained through fear, and that sufficient fear would always prevail. The model was wrong. And because the model was everything, because she had never built a self beneath the framework of calculation and control, having the framework disproved left her with nothing to stand on. The scenes of Azula in the finale, in the period before the final Agni Kai, are some of the most psychologically specific animation in the show's history. She is alone in the palace. She is talking to a hallucination of her mother. The hallucination tells her that she is loved, And Azula's response is rage, because love is the one variable she never knew how to work with. Her mother had been afraid of her. She had known it. She had told herself it did not matter. She had been wrong about that too. The blue fire flickering between orange, the lightning striking in all directions. The precision she had maintained for her entire life dissolving into something that looked more like grief than rage, though she would not have used that word. She was defeated by Katara, who used strategy rather than force, who used the water in the pipes beneath the courtyard, who used misdirection, who used her understanding of the situation to place herself exactly where Azula's lightning would go and then redirect it elsewhere. Katara won not because she was stronger than Azula, but because she was operating from a different foundation. Love rather than fear. Fluidity rather than control. Azula ended the show in chains, crying. Alone. Not dead, not redeemed, not resolved into either pole of what she could have been. Just there. The comics that followed would suggest eventual movement towards something more human in her. But the show itself left her in the courtyard, and that image, that specific unresolved image, is what the show chose to carry into its finale. Not every story has a clean ending. Not every prodigy finds their way to the place their talent deserved to take them. She was extraordinary, and she was 14, and she was, in the end, a girl who had never been allowed to be ordinary in any of the ways that ordinary can save you. Iroh's grief, the dragon that was born from loss. The turning point in Iroh's life did not happen in a training hall or a battlefield or a throne room. It happened during the siege of Ba Sing Se, when his son Lu Ten was killed. Lu Ten was Iroh's only son. He died in the war that Iroh was prosecuting on behalf of the Fire Nation, in the siege of the very city that Iroh would later come to love, in the conflict that had defined Iroh's identity as a military commander for his entire adult life up to that point. The death was not heroic in any special way. Lu Ten died in a war. People die in wars. Iroh lifted the siege. He went home. He was the crown prince of the Fire Nation, the next Fire Lord, the most decorated military figure in the nation's modern history. He had the title Dragon of the West. He had a legacy that the Fire Nation would have celebrated for generations. He gave it all up. He did not make a formal announcement or a dramatic renunciation. He simply stopped. He stopped the siege. He returned home. He grieved. He grieved in a way that his culture did not have a good framework for, because the Fire Nation of the 100-Year War era was not a culture that had made much space for grief. It had made space for victory and for shame, but grief, the specific kind that comes from the loss of someone you love with no qualification, was harder to accommodate. He left the palace. He wandered. He found the Sun Warriors. He found Ran and Shaw. He encountered Agni Kai culture and the Order of the White Lotus, and tea and music, and the slow, patient disciplines of a man who has decided that he no longer wants to be the thing he was. What came back from this wandering was not the crown prince. It was something quieter and stranger and, in the long run, considerably more powerful. A man who had lost the scaffolding of identity, the role and the title and the purpose, and had rebuilt from the inside out. Who had found in the loss of his son a perspective that the Fire Nation's ideology could not provide. Who had been to the source of fire, to the dragons themselves, and been taught that fire was not conquest. His firebending after this transformation drew from a completely different source than his brother Ozai's. Ozai bent from dominance and will. Iroh bent from the place the dragons had shown him. The warmth, the life in the flame. This was not weakness. This was, in fact, the original teaching. The Sun Warriors, the human civilization that had first learned firebending, had learned it this way. The Fire Nation's rage-fueled aggression was the deviation, not the norm. The lightning redirection technique he invented reflects this. To redirect lightning, you have to be a vessel rather than a source. You have to be willing to let enormous, potentially lethal energy pass through you rather than trying to stop it or match it. The technique works by accepting the force rather than opposing it. This is not a firebending philosophy. It is a waterbending philosophy applied within a firebending context. Iroh crossed the disciplinary boundary because he had spent enough time studying each bending tradition to see what they shared and what they could teach each other. He taught it to Zuko, who needed it, who had spent his whole life being hit by enormous forces, by his father's disapproval and his nation's shame and his own internal conflict, and who had always tried to absorb or resist rather than redirect. The lightning redirection technique was not just a physical skill, it was a model for how to survive Ozai without being destroyed by him. Let the energy come, move it through you. Send it somewhere it cannot hurt you. Zuko eventually redirected Ozai's actual lightning. The technique worked. Iroh in the Order of the White Lotus liberation of Ba Sing Se is the final demonstration of what he had become. He assembled the members. He coordinated. He walked into the occupied city and took it back not through the raw power of overwhelming force, but through a group of old masters who had been practicing their entire lives to be the best versions of what they were. The blast that broke the inner wall was enormous. It was decisive. It came from a man who had chosen peace and who demonstrated, clearly and without ambiguity, that choosing peace is not the same as being incapable of force. The Jasmine Dragon, his tea shop in Ba Sing Se. He was not running a tea shop because he had no other options. He was running a tea shop because it was the life he wanted. He was extraordinarily good at it. The tea he made was good enough that a Ba Sing Se official, upon tasting it, gave Iroh his own shop specifically so that the city could have consistent access to it. Iroh reported this as the proudest moment of his life, which he meant completely and which was not in any way a joke. He visited Lu Ten's grave in the show's most emotionally devastating scene. He sat by a small memorial he had set up in Ba Sing Se. He sang a song called Leaves from the Vine, which was performed by Mako Iwamatsu, the original voice of Iroh, in one of the last recordings he made before his death. The dedication at the end of that episode reads, "In honor of Mako." The song is about fallen leaves, about small things departing, about the weight of absence and the grace of memory. There is a reason Iroh is the character most often cited by Avatar fans as the one who means the most to them. He is not the most powerful in a combat sense. He is not the Avatar. He does not drive the plot in the way that Aang or Zuko does, but he knows something they are still learning. He knows what it costs to be certain that you are right about something, and to then discover that you were wrong. He knows what it feels like to lose the most important thing, and to then have to decide who to be afterward. He knows that the warmth in fire is not a metaphor but a physical reality that the practitioners of his element had forgotten. He carries that knowledge with particular gentleness. Not because it is light, but because he understands that the way you carry something heavy matters as much as the fact that you carry it at all. Toph's world, what it is to see everything except what eyes can see. Toph Beifong was not born into a world that was built for her. This is a statement that could be made about many characters in Avatar, but for Toph it has a specific quality. The world was not built for her in the most literal way available. The visual world that most people navigate, the world of faces and colors and the expressions that pass across someone's face when they are trying to hide what they feel, was simply not present for her in any of its usual forms. What she had instead was a world made of vibration and pressure and the specific quality of how solid things moved against each other. This world was richer than most people ever encounter. It had depth and texture and information packed into it that sighted people were not trained to extract because they had never needed to. A footstep on stone told Toph the approximate weight of the person, their gait, their emotional state, whether they were moving with confidence or uncertainty, whether they were trying to be quiet. A shift in the ground nearby told her something had changed, and the quality of the shift told her what. She had learned this from the badger moles. The badger moles were the original earthbenders, not the original human earthbenders, the actual origin. The creatures from whom the first humans learned to bend earth by observing and imitating. They were enormous and blind, and they navigated the world through seismic sensitivity, through the information carried in vibration, through the earth as a medium of perception rather than a medium of construction. Toph had found them as a small child, wandering into their tunnels without fully understanding what she was doing. What she found in those tunnels was not danger, as her parents would have feared, but recognition. These enormous, powerful, sightless creatures were navigating the world in exactly the way she had been trying to navigate it. They had developed a relationship with the earth that was fundamentally different from what human earthbenders practiced. They did not bend earth as a tool. They experienced earth as a sense. They were not controlling it. They were in conversation with it. Toph learned both things simultaneously. She learned from the badger moles how to deepen and refine her seismic sense into something more systematic and more powerful than the intuitive version she had been developing on her own. And she learned from them that earthbending was not only about force and mass and the movement of rock, it was about relationship, about what you could know through contact with the ground beneath you. Her fighting style reflected all of this. She stood still in ways that looked like passivity but were actually absolute engagement. While she was standing still, she was reading. Every shift in weight from her opponent, every micro-adjustment of their stance, every breath that changed the pressure through their feet to the ground was information. By the time she moved, she already knew what was coming. She was not reacting. She was finishing a sentence she had started reading 3 seconds ago. The compactness of her southern praying mantis style was not just a physical adaptation. It was a philosophical expression. She did not need the wide, heavy stance of Hungar because she was not trying to be immovable in the way that style intended. She was already immovable in the way that mattered. Not because her stance prevented her from being moved, but because she knew exactly where she was at all times, exactly what the ground beneath her was doing, exactly what was coming and from which angle. You cannot knock over someone who already knows you are going to try. When she was placed in the metal cage, she was in the worst possible situation. Off the ground, which disabled her seismic sense entirely. Enclosed, which prevented any kind of escape through conventional earthbending because there was no earth to bend. Held by 2 experienced benders who knew exactly how earthbenders fought and had structured her imprisonment specifically to neutralize her abilities. She sat in the dark. She started hitting the walls. The vibrations she sent into the metal came back to her, and in those returning vibrations she felt something. Not earth in the way rock is earth, or soil is earth, or stone is earth. Something much smaller. Impurities. Fragments of unrefined material that had survived the smelting and the refining and the shaping into sheets of metal. Traces that no other earthbender had ever been able to work with, because no other earthbender had ever had the sensitivity to feel them at all. Toph's seismic sense, developed over 12 years of necessity and badger mole instruction and underground fighting, was fine-grained enough to reach those traces. And once she could feel them, she could bend them. And once she could bend them, the metal moved. She destroyed the cage. She climbed out. She sealed her captors inside. And she walked away having invented an entirely new branch of earthbending that had been considered categorically impossible for the entire recorded history of the art. She went on to found the Beifong Metal Bending Academy after the war, the first institution dedicated to teaching metal bending. She trained 3 students initially. She chose them by sensing which of them caused her meteorite bracelet, the small piece of space rock that Sokka had given her from the leftover material of his meteor sword, to resonate. Space Earth, she called it, Earth that had come from beyond the sky. She wore it every day and never took it off because it was a gift from a friend who had not made a thing of giving it, who had just thought she might like it, and she did. That bracelet appears in the background of multiple episodes in books 2 and 3. The show never draws attention to it. It is simply there on her wrist in scene after scene. A small, constant piece of a relationship that the show understands without explaining. Katara's water what the ocean teaches you about surviving loss. There is a quality to water that the other elements do not share. It can exist in more states than any of them. Solid ice. Flowing liquid. Rising vapor. It can move from one state to another and back again without losing anything essential about itself. It is the same water whether it is a glacier or a river or a cloud. The form changes. The substance persists. Katara learned this principle without being taught it, because it was the principle she was already living. She had been the girl with the mother, and then, suddenly and violently, the girl without one. She had been the older sibling and then, effectively, a form of parent within her household. She had been the only waterbender in her tribe, and then, with Aang's arrival, something adjacent to the opposite, a person who did not know nearly as much as she had thought, and who had to learn quickly, and from wherever learning was available. She adapted, continuously, rapidly, without making a significant performance of the adaptation. She carried her grief, and she carried her growing skill, and she carried her brother and her team, and she did not put any of these things down when she picked up the next one. Water holds more at once than any other element can. So did she. Her training under Pakku at the North Pole was brief by the standards of formal waterbending instruction. She arrived there with the skills she had taught herself from the scroll and from necessity, and she left as a full master. What she learned in the North Pole was structure and form, and the names for techniques she had been improvising for months. She already knew how to do most of what Pakku taught her. She needed him to tell her that what she was doing was real and formal and correct. The healing she learned at the North Pole was taught to her by Yagoda, in the separate section of the waterbending curriculum that the Northern Water Tribe assigned to women. Katara was frustrated by this division. She had come to learn combat bending. She was given healing instead, and then she realized that healing was not a lesser discipline. It was the most intimate possible relationship with water, because it required extending your perception into the water inside another body and moving that water with the precision of surgery and the intent of care. She brought someone back from drowning. She neutralized poison by drawing the contaminated fluid from a person's body while leaving the healthy fluid intact. She maintained life in a person whose heart had stopped, the most desperate and specific form of healing that waterbending could offer. And the same sensitivity that enabled all of this was what made bloodbending available to her. She did not want it. She said this clearly, and she meant it, and the show believed her. After Hama forced her to use it in that confrontation in the Fire Nation village, Katara made the choice to not use it again. She did not succeed in keeping this promise perfectly. The Southern Raiders episode was the exception. But even there, she used it and then stopped and then made the choice she made, which was to let the man go. To be the kind of person who had the power and chose how to use it. Years after the events of the show, she would work with world leaders to have bloodbending outlawed entirely. The prohibition never fully contained the practice, because some skills cannot be unlearned once they are known, and Yakone and his sons demonstrated what bloodbending in the hands of a practitioner who had no compunction about using it could do. But Katara's effort to make the practice illegal, to establish a social and legal framework of consequence around it, reflected her belief that having the power to do a thing did not mean the thing should be done. She was not naive about power. She had spent too much of her life on the wrong end of it for naivety. She understood its weight. She understood its texture. She chose, repeatedly and with full knowledge of what she was choosing, to use hers in the service of something beyond herself. The show ends with her and Aang together on a balcony at the Jasmine Dragon, the sun going down behind them, the camera slowly pulling back to give them distance, to release them. They had been followed so closely for so long, the camera almost always within arm's reach, and in the final seconds it just lets them go. She is standing there in the warm light, still a waterbender, still carrying all of it. The grief and the power and the long year of the war and the moment by the campfire when she chose not to use what she had. She is still there whenever you go back. What remains? Every one of them is still there when you close your eyes. Wan with his stolen fire, banished into the spirit wilds, deciding to look around instead of despair. Rava, older than civilization, choosing to partner with a young man who had just made a terrible mistake. Ozai with his 100 suns burning away everything that was not conquest. Azula with her blue fire and her perfect form, alone in the palace, talking to someone who was not there. Kyoshi at 230, making the choice to stop. Iroh with his tea, with his quiet power, with his son's memory and Rananshaw's fire, and the long transformation of a man who had everything the world offered and gave it back to build something truer. Toph in her metal cage, in the dark, hitting the walls until the walls answered. Aang between all the lives, choosing to be himself at the moment when himself was what mattered most. Katara by the fire, holding the power she would not use, stronger for the holding than she would have been for the using. All of them made of the same world. All of them demonstrating the same thing from different angles. That strength is not what you can do. Strength is what you understand about what you can do, and the wisdom with which you choose to do it or not do it, and the kind of fire or water or earth or air you draw it from. That is what Avatar always knew. What it put into every frame and every brushstroke of calligraphy and every carefully choreographed bending sequence and every moment of silence that said more than any music could. Power comes from understanding. And understanding, the real kind, the kind that changes how you move through the world, comes from paying attention to the world, to the people in it, to the stories that were built impossibly carefully by people who believed a Saturday afternoon cartoon deserved to be a great work of art. They were right, and you have been here for all of it. Go to sleep now. The world of Avatar is still there. It will be there when you come back. It always is. Drop a like if this helped you settle down for the night. And subscribe so you are here next time we go back in. There is always more. There are always more rooms. Sleep well. One more thing, before the night takes over completely. There is a quality that all of the most powerful characters in Avatar share that is harder to name than any technique or ability or element. It is the quality of having been changed by something. Juan was changed by the guilt of freeing Vatu and the commitment that followed it. Rava was changed by choosing to partner with a human rather than fight alone. Ozai was changed by nothing, which is exactly the shape of his limitation and his eventual defeat. Azula was changed by the moment her framework of fear stopped working, by the crack that opened when two people she thought she owned chose something she had never accounted for. Kyoshi was changed by centuries of watching what she had built grow and corrupt and endure and fall apart and endure again. Iroh was changed by his son's death in a way that remade him entirely. Toph was changed by the badger moles who showed her what her blindness could be if she stopped experiencing it as an absence and started experiencing it as a presence. Aang was changed by finding Gyatso's skeleton and by the 100 years of loss he had slept through and by the choice he finally made to stay in the world rather than run from what it required of him. Katara was changed by her mother's sacrifice and by Hama and by the choice she made in a cold courtyard near the fire when she finally had the man in front of her and decided to put the water down. Every one of them carries something that changed them. Every one of them built their power from inside that change. This is the show's most honest statement about what strength actually is. Not the absence of damage. Not immunity to loss or grief or failure or the specific weight of having been someone who made a mistake that cost something irreplaceable. The most powerful characters in Avatar are the ones who were broken open by something real and chose to build themselves around the opening rather than close it back up. The fire that Iroh bends is warmer than Ozai's because Iroh knows what he lost. The water that Katara bends is deeper than Pakku's because Katara knows what it feels like to hold something precious and have it taken from you. The earth that Toph bends is more precise than any other earthbenders because Toph knows, in a way no sighted person can quite replicate, that the world is made of information you have to be willing to receive on its own terms. And Aang, who is the center of everything, the fulcrum around which the entire story balances, is powerful not because he is the Avatar or because he has mastered the four elements or because Rava lives inside him and makes his eyes glow white when the cosmic balance is at stake. He is powerful because he is 12 years old and has been awake for 100 years worth of loss, and he chooses, every morning, to still love the world, to still find the flying and the food and the lemur and the friends worth loving, to still believe that the answer is not to become what hurt him but to remain, stubbornly and at significant personal cost, the thing he was before the hurt arrived. He sleeps with Momo curled near his head. He reaches for Appa when he is afraid. He laughs at things that deserve laughter, and cries at things that deserve tears, and refuses the Avatar state when the Avatar state would require him to leave the values that make him the Avatar worth being. That is power. The whole story was always about that. Let the night have you now. Let the breathing slow and the thinking quiet. You have spent time with the most powerful characters in a world that was built to carry you, and now the world is setting you gently down somewhere comfortable. The calligraphy is real, the martial arts are real, the moon tracks properly across the sky. And somewhere in the spirit wilds, Juan is still walking, still looking around, still deciding to be curious about the thing in front of him rather than afraid. Sleep well. The world will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the other hidden fact, the one beneath all the others. The world of Avatar does not close when you stop watching it. It continues in the dark. Juan still walking, Rava still carrying, Toph still listening to the ground, Katara still choosing, Iroh still steeping the tea, Aang still breathing like air itself is breathing through him. These are the people who were made to exist. The story gave them weight enough to persist. And the weight of a world built this carefully does not dissipate just because the screen goes dark. You carry it. You have been carrying it since the first time you watched, and it has been carrying something back. That was always the arrangement. That was always the point. Sleep. The world is still there. Subscribe if you want to be here next time we go back in. Like if this helped carry you somewhere tonight. Comment where you are, what time it is, and whether the Avatar world still feels like the realest fictional place you have ever lived inside. Because for most of us, it does. It always will.